All right, Cat Shade's Heavy Metal Picker here, back with another old school story from 1996. So, I had previously mentioned how I was a small time promoter of death metal shows in the Dayton, Ohio area between 1996 and 1997. At the time, I would rent out small venues, charge $5 or whatever at the door, and several local bands would play. None of which you probably heard of. Probably the most established bands would have been at the time Carved in Flesh, Foul Stench, Leveled. And if you were born after 1983 and lived outside of Western Ohio, you probably haven't even heard of most of these bands. But anyhow, since I was 19 at the time, and it wasn't too common back then to find death metal fans of legal drinking age. And above 25, I mean, such people were considered like at the time, I thought anybody over 25 may as well be 65. So there was nobody really young, or nobody that bars wouldn't have been interested in bands with such a young fan base. So after I had some modest success with some local shows, I thought, I'm pretty grandiose. I'm like, all right, I've done this. Well, maybe I can step up my game and do some bigger bands. So I tried to get Mortician to come to Dayton, Ohio. But at the time, this may have been shortly after the release of Hacked Up for Barbecue. Roger got caught selling weed, and as a result, he couldn't leave the state, and they were having trouble maintaining a touring lineup. I believe I talked to either Vic Novak or Brian Sekula. I don't know how you pronounce his last name. These guys lived in Cleveland at the time, and they were part of the Mortician touring lineup, which, as I said, wasn't too stable. So I was like totally grandiose. I thought, you know what? Maybe I could get Deicide. That I could bring Deicide to Dayton. That would be great. So Deicide had released Once Upon the Cross a year or so before, and in my eyes, they were, pretty big. Now, if I had gone through with this, I would have been in way over my head. I wouldn't have been able to handle Deicide. Those four guys, all four of them, were completely nuts, doing all kinds of drugs back then. And I definitely could not have handled that kind of audience either. So anyhow, I got the number for Deicide's booking agent at the time, John Finnberg of Front Row Booking. And the reason he was so powerful is because he had connections. Back then, it was important to have connections. But nowadays, you can just get on the internet and figure out what kind of music venues are available, how to get in touch with a band, how to get in touch with a band's manager. But at the time, John Finnberg had a monopoly on all this information. He knew everybody. And as a result, he let the power get to his head. He would treat everybody really, really badly. But I didn't know about this. That internet. We didn't even have Google back then. We used Yahoo was the search engine of choice at the time. But anyhow, so I called him up, told him I wanted to bring Deicide to Dayton, Ohio. And one thing I noticed about him was that he talked really, really, really fast. He seemed really, really agitated, was very condescending, and he had a British accent. Now, I'm not sure if this accent was real or if he was faking it. Somebody knows where he's actually from, please comment. I still to this day have no idea, and I can't find any audio interview with him or anything like that. So at the time, I had no idea why he was hollering at 1,000,000 miles an hour. At the time, I just recently smoked my first joint, had my first full can of beer, and I'm pretty sure now that he was under the influence of coke. He had to have been, because of the way that he was talking. And he was very condescending when he used music industry words that I didn't know at the time, like tour rider and guarantee. I asked for clarification as to what these words meant, and he just flipped out. It really set him off. He's like, "You're a total amateur. You don't know what you're doing." And I'm 19. He also said things that I know now were absolutely not true. He asked me how many people were going to be at this proposed show. And I said, 600. And he flipped out. He said, "You're going to need 2,000 to 3,000 for Deicide." And I'm thinking, is Deicide really that big? Because I'd just seen Morbid Angel, and Morbid Angel played Bogarts in Cincinnati, and that would have been like a 1,200 person show. And at the time, Morbid Angel was definitely bigger than Deicide. Deicide didn't have the exposure primarily because they didn't have a video on MTV's Headbangers Ball. If they had, Deicide, it would have affected the trajectory of their career had they released a video back then. So anyhow, he had to have been lying about that, because I discovered later that at the same time, Deicide had played the El Rosa Villa in Columbus, which was about a 600 person venue. So there's no way that was true at all. And I asked how much it would cost to bring Deicide to Dayton, and he said $10,000. And I'm doing the math in my head, and even as gullible as I was at the time, I knew there was no way that Deicide was getting paid $10,000 in 1996 money. That I very highly doubt that Deicide to this day gets $10,000 a show. There's no way. It's just mathematically impossible. It's not financially feasible. I mean, I bet if they played in Korea or something, they'd have to be paid $10,000 to cover the cost of travel and all that. But anyhow, he's just really condescending, very angry, very agitated, talking a million miles an hour. And it was like several months later, I read in this fanzine called The Grimoire of Exalted Deeds that John Finnberg had all kinds of unsavory business practices as far as like ripping off other bands and ripping off venues. And the front lady of Wicked Witch, apparently he would say things to her like, "If you give me a blowjob, it could help your career." And apparently he was doing this with all kinds of women who were in bands. But at the time, it's the 1997, and there's no Me Too, there's no wokeism, there's no cancel culture, and he bullied so many people, and he was just an asshole to everybody. And then it wasn't until like 2020 where he started getting dropped by all these bands that said, "Okay, we've had enough of your BS." And it blew up all over social media that, he'd been, treating people badly, sextorting women, offering to further their careers or retaliate against them if they disagreed with anything that he said. And anyhow, I'm sure you can just read all you want about this guy. And anybody who's ever dealt with John Finnberg can probably listen to what I have to say and say, yeah, I had a similar such experience. I have no idea what the guy's doing nowadays. As far as I know, he's just been finally blacklisted after all these years. And if you want to know more, I'm sure you can just Google this asshole.